Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to start. I know coffee is hard to compete with. I'm Deborah Cullen Morales, a program officer for arts and culture at the Mellon Foundation, and I'm here today to introduce the panel on a new AAMC publication. Ooh, that was great. Thank you. Is my name somewhere? Oh, good. So you all know who I am. Okay. I'm here today to introduce the panel on the new AAMC publication, The Best Practices Guide for Artist Demographic Data Coordination. This guide is so important. Please allow me to tell you a personal story as to why I think so. In 2004, when the Museum of Modern Art was closed for the Taniguchi renovation and was presenting its exhibitions in Queens, I was a curator at El Museo del Barrio. We were collaborating on a show presented at El Museo that surveyed MoMA's storied Latin American, Latinx, and Caribbean holdings, which at that time were rarely seen. I was part of the curatorial team for the show, MoMA at El Museo, Latin American and Caribbean Art from the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. My colleague Miriam Basilio and I pored over lists that were printed out for us when we asked them to give us the lists of Latinx, Latin American, Caribbean artists in the holdings, but we were mystified. We were sure that MoMA had numerous Puerto Rican artists, for example, and we wanted to highlight them at our museum, which was founded by a Puerto Rican artist and for Puerto Rican and Latinx artists. However, they were nowhere to be found in these lists. After plugging in some names ourselves into the TMS database, or whatever database MoMA was using at that time, I don't remember, we began to see what the problem was. For example, the great printmaker Antonio Martorell, who was, some of you may know, who was just awarded a National Medal of Arts from President Biden, is listed in MoMA's database as American, born Puerto Rico. The medal and this listing is an unfortunate result of Puerto Rico's colonial status. However, Martorell is listed in the Getty Union list of artist names, affectionately called ULAN by us, as Puerto Rican preferred and only then American. For while he might hold a US passport as a result of his colonial status, being a Puerto Rican, I can assure you that El Maestro would call himself Puerto Riqueño first and foremost, and American only second, or as a reference to his passport. Miriam and I found then that we had to enter names one by one into the database, searching for who we thought might be there, a slow and painstaking process. Since anyone at that time holding a US passport was listed simply as American. Felix Gonzalez Torres, Ana Mendieta, Marisol, the list goes on, but we found them. This kind of decision making is common and understandable to some degree in the efficiencies of the museum. However, it can affect the precision of our data. I have no doubt that the vast majority of collections are male and white. However, I want to note that the process offered by the very important 2019 benchmark paper out of Williams College, Diversity of Artists in Major US Museums, which we all refer to and I refer to too, but I want to just note for all of you, if you haven't read carefully, that they say their process was by scraping the public online catalogs of 18 major museums in the US and deploying a sample of 10,000 artist records comprising over 9,000 unique artists to crowdsourcing and analyzing 45,000 responses. We have inferred artist genders, ethnicities, geographic origins, and birth decades rather, sorry. At this stage of the game, we have to do better than inferring. And this certainly would, because inference certainly bakes in knowledge gaps, if not outright biases. Another example that I want to bring up, that I was just talking with my colleagues, there have been so many instances of this conversation coming up again and again in different ways. In the conversation yesterday, the Latinx panel, and Teresita's beautiful keynote speech just now. I want to talk about Juan Sanchez just briefly. Juan Sanchez is an Afro-Puerto Rican born in Brooklyn. Where does he fit? How is he categorized? What would it mean for us to include him in all of his complexity as Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Puerto Rican, Black, American, Puerto Rican, etc.? The universe and the mundo inside of all of us, as Teresita said. What would it do for him? How would it position him? What would it do for us as curators? It's often said about Puerto Ricans, ni de aquí de allá, neither here nor there. But I prefer to think yes and. So this work, which we were very proud to fund, the Mellon Foundation, is of a piece. I see it with the Mellon Demographic Survey. There's a power to be had in quantifying, tracking progress, and benchmarking over time. As Judith notes in her introduction of the paper, the pressures on staffing, the publication rather, not the paper, the pressures on staffing, budgets, and artists in undertaking a demographic data collection process can be significant. The need for organizations to complete the project at the highest levels of ethics might make it unattainable. But I don't think it's unattainable. I do think the work is far from over, and I do think it's going to be a slow process. But I'm here for all of it, and I hope you are too. After all, it took us decades to get here. As Adrian Piper provocatively wrote in one of the papers for the 2020 Burns-Halpern report, another important data collection, which I hope you've all looked at, which focuses also on demographics and museum collections, focusing specifically on Black and female representation. Adrian Piper wrote, unfortunately, having cultivated the practice of racial styling without regard to the self-defeating consequences, Americans now find it impossible to reverse without exacerbating those consequences. But I think that we can advance, not reverse, with calm, with thoughtfulness and precision. And to that end, I'm really excited to hear this panel talking about the publication. And I want to thank especially AAMC's director, Judith Pinheiro, the many colleagues who served on the Artist Demographic Data Consortium, the curators, collections, and data managers, the registrars, conservators, and archivists from more than 40 institutions in the United States who gave their time and their wisdom to this process. Please welcome the panel to tell you all about this fascinating work.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm honored to be here with you all today. I am not an art curator. I'm actually an organizational psychologist and a diversity, equity, inclusion data expert. I have an organization called Mattingly Solutions. We do workplace inclusion consulting, and myself and the rest of the panel on the stage were all involved as either writers or reviewers of the guide. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the guide, and then I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into some questions about the guide. Our organizations have recognized the need for better understanding the demographics of artists whose works in their collections and their exhibitions. While there's this understanding that surveys need to be undertaken for transparency, accountability, and internal reckoning, there's also a strong apprehension about initiating surveys without direct lines of communication, either internally or externally, priority given to ethics, and a grasp of the impact on those doing this work. To aid in the field, AAMC Foundation has partnered with curatorial and non-curatorial colleagues to create best practices guides for artist demographic data coordination, a collaboratively written guide developed with support from the Mellon Foundation. Thank you to the Mellon Foundation for that support, to provide insight for those developing surveys. Today's conversation are with some of the guide's contributors to discuss the formation, implementation, and future uses of this resource, along with ongoing questions and concerns for demographic guide collection. Well, this is so fancy. Can we advance to the next slide, please? Once again, we're very grateful to the Mellon Foundation for its support of this project. And then here is a picture of the guide. It is publicly available, and it just released a few weeks ago. It's already getting some really great reviews. We're really excited for its uptake. So to announce the panelists, and I'll start here with Marissa Del Toro, the Assistant Director of Exhibitions and Programs at Next Haven. She's been in New Haven, Connecticut at Next Haven since 2021, working with museums moving forward as co-director of research and director of communications. Previously, she served as curatorial fellow at Next Haven and as the Diversifying Art Museum Leadership Initiative curatorial fellow at the Phoenix Art Museum. She holds her MA in art history from the University of Texas at San Antonio and is originally from Southern California, where she received her BA in art history from the University of California, Riverside. Thank you for joining us. Next, we have David Max Horowitz, the assistant curator at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. He's been in the department since 2015 and has contributed to a number of special exhibitions and supported the management of the museum's permanent collection. He's the curator of Marking Time, Process and Minimal Abstraction, and co-curator of RH Quantum plus X, Chapter 34. Additionally, he worked closely with Hilma A.F. Clint, Paintings for the Future, and Agnes Martin, as well as the Guggenheim Collection, Brancusi, and Guggenheim Collection, Early Modernism. David also regularly assists in the continued care and stewardship of permanent collection. And while most focused on post-war period, he has conducted research on works from all parts of the museum's holdings. He holds his BA in English Literature and Language from the University of Maryland College Park and an interdisciplinary MLA from Johns Hopkins University. He's currently pursuing an MA in Art History from Hunter College. Thank you for joining us. Next, we have Liz Munsell from the Barnett and Annalee Newman Curator of Contemporary Art at the Jewish Museum of New York. She co-leads the museum's Moving Forward, a Ford and Mellon funded research initiative to advance equity in the museum sector. Previously, she served as the inaugural Lorraine and Alan Bresser Curator of Contemporary Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where she organized numerous exhibits. Beginning in 2012, Munsell worked to establish the MFA as the first encyclopedic museum in the U.S. to fully integrate performance art into its exhibitions and permanent collection. Between 2012 and 2017, she held a visiting curator post at Harvard University's David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. A Fulbright Scholar to Chile in 2006, Munsell holds a BA in International Letters and Visual Studies from Tufts University and a Master's in Cultural Studies from the University of Chile. And then last but not least, we have Sarah Osborne Bender, who is the head of technical services at the National Gallery of Art Library, where she oversees cataloging, metadata, and acquisitions. She's a member of Cataloging Advisory Committee of the Art Library Society of North America and the Getty Vocabulary Steering Committee, and was a contributing writer for the AAMC's Best Practices Guide, along with everyone on the stage. She led the foundation of the Judy Chicago Visual Archive at the National Museum of Women and Arts, where she also curated exhibitions on Chicago, Simone de Beauvoir, and artist books. She has worked in museum libraries for over 20 years, and Sarah makes opportunities for meaningful exploration of collections and collection data through descriptive, preservation, openness, and outreach. Super thrilled to have these panelists joining us here today. So let's start off with what was the need for this guide?
I can start. Well, I guess I just first want to say that this panel and this effort, I guess it's really the height of museum nerdness. And so I want to thank you all, like post-lunch, post-amazing talk by Teresita Fernandez for hanging in there with us. This is not a glamorous effort, right? So thank you, Deb, for funding the and to the Mellon for funding the non-glamorous effort that this is. But oftentimes the most unglamorous efforts are the most important. And really the need for this guide came out of conversations that many of us had been having in these spaces and others about professionalizing our museum practices and making up for lost time and historical practices that perhaps weren't the best in our institutions. We're certainly not the most inclusive, and needing to be more accountable, both for our institutions in the past and to hold ourselves accountable for creating greater equity within our collections moving forward.
And I'll just say, as Deborah said in her introduction, a lot of the problem is coming from these lists that we're all relying on. And her anecdote was, I believe, 19 years old, but could have been told probably yesterday at many of our institutions.
I just want to add to thinking that the need for this guide was to address kind of the ethics and care involved and what is needed to carry out this data that proves the problem of issues with museum collections being predominantly white and male, which we all know, and then also addressing the issue of how do we identify artists, or, and having this conversation on how to do it. What is the process and need for this within our museum spaces and our communities? Also the cultural sphere, because museums define that. And how are we moving and shaping society as we go about this within the museum itself?
Yeah, and just picking up on the notion of ethics of care, I think one of the things when this group first started to kind of form organically and then was very happily shepherded by the AAMC, is as we talked about how to gather this kind of information on artists, we realized that it's very thorny, it's very complicated to do things in a way that is that centers care, that centers the voice of the artist, that is ethical, that is also accurate, that allows you to do work that is clear and communicative with a public. And so to make something coherent out of it as well, it's a lot to balance, and it requires a lot of decision making, a lot of careful thought, a lot of buy-in from across the museum, maybe even parts of the museum that I don't think any of us, well, maybe not, I shouldn't say that, but perhaps wouldn't have considered at the outset. And we learned so much just by talking with each other in that big group in the Artist Demographic Consortium, that 40 plus museums, that we realized that there was really a need to kind of codify just a kind of thought process, how you kind of get this started, how you get buy-in, what you need to consider as you go, because it's something that I think there's an expectation of it being simple, even though we all know how complicated identity is. And it really is very complicated, and there's lots of decisions to be made. There's not one roadmap either, which we also discovered through the process.
Something to add is it's the process. I think we get really hung up on what the data is, and all the data is very important. What's the process for collecting the data, for communicating out the data, storing the data? And so that really was a big push of the guide to give that process, give that step-by-step guidebook above and beyond just what the data is in and of itself. For the next question, how can we ensure that the artists are centered throughout this process?
So one of the premises of the guide is that all of the data will be artist identified, self-identified, which Deb spoke to. And the need for that is pretty clear. I certainly, as curators, we have all been in the position of researching an artist, finding what is publicly available about them, analyzing their work. Maybe their work centers Black identity, for example, but that has nothing to do with the fact that the person may identify as both Black and multiracial, or coming from a certain familial tradition that isn't even registered in our questionnaire. So there's a space where, of course, we recommend the artists can write in how they identify. So really leaning into artist identification is key. It also introduces an added layer of complexity, which is, of course, that we need to go to the artists themselves directly, not a studio assistant, not a gallerist, and ask for them to complete these guides. And then multiply that by the however many number of museums that are trying to do this for their own collections. It's a lot of data, maybe too much. And certainly we, at points in this process, discuss the need to centralize this information somewhere, some institution being the kind of holders. But that is a much larger process that will take a lot longer. And there's an immediate need for our institutions to get a hold of the information that we can right now. But certainly we're looking forward to hopefully not bombarding artists all at once. And maybe there needs to be, a coordinated effort between institutions. And in order to be successful and expect the artists are going to fill out these questionnaires and being respectful of their time, as well as our own staff members as well.
In addition to making sure that we're asking the artists about how they identify, we need to create space for them to get in touch with us, that they have access to that information, that they have the ability to change that information, that they have the ability to see the information that we have on them, that when we communicate with them about what we're using that information for and what we're the ways that we're going to handle it, that we're clear with them, right? So that it always is about setting a kind of expectation and a realistic expectation, things that we can deliver on, and also giving that kind of access for the possibility of change, for the possibility of adjustment. We all know that identity has a kind of fluidity, and we have to be able to be responsive and reactive to that. And so it's about centering them as a kind of ongoing process, which is making sure that you also have that kind of contact point moving forward.
And designing the questionnaire in a way that accommodates the artist's voice, the artist's language, having a way to not be restrained by the capabilities of whatever system you're recording this in, being able to record directly an artist answer, but having some way to translate them into something that can be reportable while also still preserving the actual voice or words of the artist. I think there's, I wasn't on the groups that worked on this, but we did talk a bit about creating these questionnaires in conjunction with artists, talking to them about how these questions would best be posed, what kinds of responses they would consider giving, and how that information would translate into usable data for us while still preserving their voice.
Oh, okay, I just wanted to mention, like, so I worked on the conceptualization part of the guide, and we thought about the artist as being centered in the beginning stages of it. You know, first comes the assessment of like assessing whether the museum institution is capable of handling this data process, and then identifying who the stakeholders would be, which would, number one, in my opinion, would be the artists, because without them, we can't collect this data accurately or collaboratively, and that's what it takes. You know, there are a bunch of other stakeholders involved, but the artists would be the center throughout the process because this is about them. And as we mentioned, like, you know, identifying how they can access the information and feeling comfortable too about what it is they're giving, you know, in addition to like their artwork being collected by an institution, but also the information about themselves as well.
Yeah, and that leads in actually very perfectly to the thing that I got so eager to say, which was also to make sure that we're not in a position where we're coercing an artist or they feel coerced, you know? So when we're asking these questions, not tying them to the like as a necessary deliverable, if this is part of an acquisition process where they won't get paid until they do this piece of paperwork. For each question to have the ability to opt out, to skip, to have space to, if you have a structured multi-choice question, to have space to enter something else, something individual, so that there is that constant ability to have agency as they are moving through that form, so that they can really still be in a position of control in how they're giving us information, what kind of information that they're giving us. I should say there's one caveat, you know, they have to give us the most basic information so we can track the thing. So, you know, like we definitely need like a name and an email address, but, you know, beyond that, you know, not to make anything a kind of necessary thing to be answered, and for them to be able to opt out of the process of the form altogether.
So one technical follow-up and one more general comment. So the technical follow-up is a way to allow for skipping, because you don't want them to necessarily skip items, is always having a choose not to respond option. So because if you have them skip, then they potentially might not fill it out at all, and then we'll lose all the data, which would be so sad. And then the general comment is something that really came through in all the panelists' responses, is the need to create this process as a conversation between yourself and the artist. So giving a option, always including some sort of person to reach out to above and beyond what the questionnaire is, having that opportunity for translation, for ongoing conversation, and, you know, working in this space, the terms, even just the one demographic variable of gender, think about how much that has changed for the various options that should be included on a questionnaire. So always giving that opportunity for updating, revising, and having the language that the artist prefers to be used when it comes to describing their identity. So that conversation and piece, I feel like, was really important.
Yes, and certainly not tying, payment for an acquisition to completion of this form, but it's not a bad idea to wrap this into acquisitions processes to make it easier on artists, include it with the paperwork that they're already receiving.
Baking it into the process is critical. All right, moving on to our next question. What impact does collecting demographic data have on how museums operate?
I'll just say from a practical point of view, it means that the institution really needs to have a committed, sustained way of carrying this onward. You know, we talk a lot in the guide about how this is not a project with a beginning and an end. So as we're talking about all of these, you know, being available for artists to reach out or being able to perform updates, this needs to be part of someone's regular work. People need to be trained in sort of the data literacy around this. How do we talk about this data? How do we use this data? So it's not, you know, just a few lines added onto a form that gets folded into some data entry. That it really needs to be more of a holistic process throughout the institution.
And just as a kind of note, I think the best practices guide itself will help you kind of understand that in a more detailed way. But we also, I think, hope that it operates as a kind of tool to advocate for those resources, because we are talking about staff time, we are talking about systems. It really requires a lot. And we know that there can be a kind of resistance to that kind of expansion. And we think the kind of infrastructures that are pointed to in the guide, hopefully you can take that to more senior people and use that as a way of advocating so that you can kind of fold that into museum operations in a way that is sustainable, because we do need this information.
I also think about the impact it will have, like in regards to staff capacity, but also community aspect too, and like how is this being just like this awareness and being transparent with the community on what this information is. And that's part of the process that is in the guide too, on like one of the stakeholders of like who's involved in this process. And like definitely staff involvement is necessary as well as artists, but also community members to know like what is this information doing for the museum and their space in their communities, and how it is like, is it changing things, you know? So more, it's going to lead to like more transparency, but I think for some institutions that can be always a little hairy at times. And because it is a risk, there's always a risk. And I think it's about being brave to understand that, you know, this will not be perfect. The process will always have to be reevaluated. And I think the guide has certain sections where it talks about that and discusses that, you know, the impact it has on the staff, but also the many stakeholders inside and outside of the institution itself. And just, you know, questioning whether is this ready, or, you know, are you ready? Is the institution ready? Are the community members ready? But the impact of it overall has the potential to lead to a lot of change within museums and impact that we may not see quantifiably, but qualitatively, it could lead to, you know, better outcomes. I always have hope that there will be better outcomes from this data.
Yeah, and quantifiably, you know, one way of moving forward after you do know what is in the demographics of the artists in your collection is making adjustments to your collection strategies moving forward. And an example of that at the Jewish Museum where I work, we have a commitment by financial year 2025 to dedicate 20% of our acquisitions funds to artists of color. And that is a practice that I'm new at the institution, so I was personally pleasantly surprised when I saw that that was a goal and a metric for the collection moving forward. Certainly some have argued that quotas are not enough. If we are striving to make our collections look like the people in our cities, the demographics of people in our cities, you know, is that work really sufficient? And I think the answer is no, we have to do more, but at the same time, we need to measure what matters. and holding ourselves to quotas is one very tangible way to ensure that we're perhaps not correcting for the past, but we're striving perhaps too slowly, one would argue, towards more equity in terms of representation of artists in our collection.
I think one final point is when it comes to the staffing, making sure that there's a dedicated resource specifically for this work. Even though the panelists have talked a lot about the importance of incorporating as many stakeholders as possible, which is critical for the success of these efforts, having a key point person of someone who's responsible for doing the work, maintaining the data, being that representative to have those conversations that we talked about earlier is really critical, because whenever we don't have an owner of this work, that's when things can start to really fall by the wayside.
Yeah, just actually to pick up just on well, it actually kind of connects with this as well. But, I think it really is key to talk across so many departments. There are departments that have to functionally be involved in kind of basic way. You think about curatorial with your artist outreach, you think about registrar, your TMS administrators, collection managers, depending on what kind of roles you have, who are going to be working with this data, librarians and archivists who are also involved in these kinds of efforts. But there's also, to talk to other departments that are thinking on similar lines about gathering this own information. So visitor experience, marketing, education. I think it's also really important, and at the Guggenheim has been really productive to have repeated conversations with the press team, with the marketing team, so that they understand how we're dealing with this information, the way we're thinking about this information, so that if they get requests, they already understand where we're coming from, and how important it is to get this information in a way that is careful and correct and ethical, and that's not always a fast process, and that's not always going to fit into a kind of cutout that is created by a third party. Also advancement for grant writing. And I think that we've actually, through repeated conversations, have developed a lot of buy-in also at the most senior levels of the museum. But it is about reaching out, talking about this repeatedly, so that everyone across the institution understands why this is important, why this has to happen, and you don't end up at cross purposes and being in a position where you have to do something that are against the policies that you're trying to lay out in this process of developing these best practices or adapting them for your own institution.
And that internal collaboration is critical. And that leads us to our next question about this external accountability and transparency piece. So what does accountability look like when it comes to the transparency of this work to the press and the public?
Everyone's looking at me, so I'll just answer. I think for me, it comes down to like listening and listening to what the questions that are being asked on this data, and again the process from both press and public, and trying to see how that is working with the process itself that is being maintained. As we've mentioned, the stakeholders involved, community members, artists, staff, not just curatorial wise or registrar wise, but across the board, education, but even like thinking about gallery tenants, they should be involved in this as well. And I think it is just about listening and then readjusting to any of the issues or positive feedback that may be coming from this. And, like I've mentioned, like, the process is never perfect. I know that's kind of a thing within the American society about perfectionism, but in order to make change, there has to be, at times, failures, a step back, but you go 2 steps forward. And I think that is what accountability looks like, when you can listen to the issues at hand and really listen and make the change that's necessary for like a better future for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's really important to ensure that this data can be public, which means processing it as quickly as possible. We have efforts by amazing journalists, for example, the Halpern Spurns report that Deb mentioned earlier. these Charlotte and Julia, who put forward this report that was summarized in late last year, were not data scientists, right? They didn't get the process perfect, as Marissa is saying, but they saw a need to create this field-wide study because one had really not been put forward about their first focus was demographics collection on women artists in the collection, and their second was African American, and then they kind of looked at the intersection in their most recent report and found that despite all of the progress that we think that we've made, all of the kind of pats on the backs about more inclusivity in the field from 2008 to 2020, only 0.5% of acquisitions made by museums were by works by women of color, so Black women specifically, actually. So we need to have this information and be honest about it. I think that will both propel the public to hold us accountable and enable us to hold ourselves more accountable. And if we don't do it, certainly journalists and others are going to be doing it for us.
And I think just sort of literally on the topic of accountability and transparency within the artist questionnaire itself, being clear in the document that the artist is receiving, why are you recording this data and what are you going to do with it? Don't record anything that you don't intend to report on or share. If you can't use the data, don't ask for the data. Also, being clear about what will be reported on as an aggregate and what would be recorded on, or reported on an individual level, and keeping in mind the difference between this information, say in a narrative or a scholarly context versus just being put out there as stats. Like all of this is very nuanced handling of this data, and it needs to be clear at the outset on the questionnaire.
Yeah, Sarah, that same page. I think that in terms of the information that we share out with the public, that kind of question of what we share in the aggregate and what we share on the individual level is a really important distinction to make. And it's something to decide how you want to use this information before you start designing this questionnaire, and to communicate that very clearly with the artist. That being said, I think something that became very clear through repeated discussions is that we're also, as institutions, not in a position to guarantee absolute privacy of information. So we can say we'll collect this information, our best intention is only to use it in the aggregate, but we can't quite guarantee that. So if you really don't want us to know, don't tell us. And to be explicit with that when you're communicating with artists. And I think there's also the question, there's this big hunger to understand the patterns of representation of the identities of the artists that are in our collections and in our exhibition programs. But those aspects of their identity might not always be things that they center in the kind of discourse around their work. And so there also has to be care taken between separating to the messy, it's messy, but to the extent one can, between asking about the individual for that kind of work, for that kind of pie chart that people really want to see in something like the Burns-Halpern report, and asking for information that you're going to integrate into interpretive materials, into explicitly public-facing materials about that artist's given work that is coming into the collection or being shown in the museum, and to really think about those things as not being exactly the same and needing to ask those questions in different ways and potentially on different forms.
Really gets at the communication piece that we were talking about earlier. So not just in communicating internally, the necessity of doing this work and communicating with the artists, but communicating with the public as well, and thinking about how can we translate the data that we're collecting and the findings we're getting into consumable ways that we can share that out with the broader press. So even thinking about what's the press release that's going to come out afterwards? What are these press conversations that are going to happen? How can we share with the broader community the work we're doing and the results that we're finding, as opposed to just having it housed inside the museum or the collection in and of itself? Thank you for that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the diversity of the contributors to the document and how those diverse perspectives influence the final guide and recommendations.
Well, I can say we started with, not started with, but ultimately had more than 40 museums across the country, different sizes, different geographic regions, different kind of focuses. And we wanted to make sure on that front that we had a kind of diversity of institutions and also diversity of kind of individuals that we had, both in terms of job function, of course, that became really important. I mean, this was overseen by the AAMC, but we had registrars, we had collection managers, we had people from library and archives, and also hopefully, you know, diversity of identities within that group so that we could always have that kind of understanding. And I think as you adapt these as these practices to your own institution, it also is a matter about trying to create that kind of internal group as well. But you also don't want to create a kind of burden on those people who may be part of a marginalized community to have to talk to this, to have to in some way be the voice of their community as they work on this. So it's about creating a kind of space for that dialogue, creating kind of space to be involved, but not a kind of pressure or necessity to, and to understand that you have to avoid that kind of creation of that kind of burden of representing a full community, that's like something that's incredibly unfair, but easy to do in institutions that are often so predominantly white. And so something that as you integrate this into your own way of working to continue to have a kind of care, just in terms of your internal processes.
Yeah, to provide a tangible example, I co-authored the implementation section with Christine Kwan, who is the executive director of Creative Capital. And so coming from a very different context than me, encyclopedic and now mid-scaled museum with a collection, Christine could really offer the perspective of her experience chasing down artists to get them to fill out forms and, you know, the challenges around that. And certainly, you know, museums haven't been traditionally set up for this sort of exercise. So we really had people coming at this guide from multiple angles, with always keeping the artist at the center of the conversation.
I just want to add too, for my section of it, there was contributors who had already gone through the process of creating like a data set guide. So they had been through like the ringer and the process of getting everyone on board of the museum and then being it put on hold or then restarting it and getting it going finally. So there was that perspective, which I think greatly influenced like the reality and realistic approach the guide gives, and that it's not just theoretical. This is also coming from people who've experienced it, but also different perspectives of individuals who are, you know, concerned about data collection and like questioning what does that mean and, you know, the ethics involved in it. So it is a broad range of contributors and reviewers who are, I think, passionate in a way of like doing this with as much care and concern as possible, no matter how like at times it can be an uncomfortable like conversation to have. There was also, you know, contributors who were non-art based, so they're bringing a different perspective to this guide as well, thinking about it in a more real life situational kind of approach and not just from artistical standing on what collecting data of this nature is.
And we're going to go to the last question because we want to have some time for our audience Q&A. So what do you see as the future vision for this work? And what would you want the impact to be on the art community and the world?
Certainly funding ourselves with collections that look more like the populations we claim to serve. And, you know, I think we can have a debate. I would love to have others' thoughts on the proposal to apply quotas to our collections activity. I know it's a controversial subject. and I just haven't found, and it's something we've discussed in museums moving forward and in other spaces, an alternative, ways to really like tangibly by the numbers, hold ourselves accountable. And I hope that this guide will get us there as a field, or at least get us a little closer, as Naomi Beckwith and others have liked to remind us. It's going to take decades, but I think we're all in it for the long haul.
Definitely. This is, picking up on something that Liz said. I think also, hopefully, as we start to get a clearer picture of those patterns of representation, that we can think about what our goals are in a more concrete way. I think we talk about the museum reflecting the communities that we serve, but that oftentimes is a very kind of nebulous conception. I mean, I work museum on the Upper East Side. That's before the pandemic, 70% European tourists for visitation, and I think that is not really, in a way, that's our public. And that is very important to us, but that's also not quite what we mean when we use that phrase. And so I think to think about that in a very specific way. There's also Terrence Washington in his piece as part of the Burns-Halpern report points out that, because of genocidal violence, Native American communities in this country are grossly underrepresented. So if we just clearly have a kind of matching percentage, is that really kind of justice? Likewise, Black communities in this country, years of genocidal violence, and what does that mean in terms of what the population is or should be? And I think you can think about those similar terms for all kinds of marginalized communities. And so as we think about what our quotas, what success looks like, I hope that kind of having these basic numbers and seeing, which are going to, no matter what, they're going to show us that we have a long way to go, but kind of hopefully will help clarify where we want to be in some way as well.
And as the librarian in the room, I'll give the non-poetic nuts and bolts answer, which is that I think it would be great to see this lead to an embraced approach to shared standards and core properties and exchangeable data that would really just make this operational for everybody.
Yeah, definitely collaboration across institutions. I think that would be amazing. I also think the vision I hold for this is that it would lead to greater nuances and complexities of art, and beyond the categories that we've been pigeonholing artists of color, underrepresented artists, giving them more space to just like exist beyond the checkbox that they or others have assigned to them. So I think for me, it's about the complexity nuances, and giving them space to just exist as they are and how they see themselves.
It really gets back to the contextualization that we heard so much about in the previous keynote speech, and how can we use the data to tell the story, not let the data be the story in and of itself. As the non-art person up here, that's my personal vision of how we can use the data to tell the stories that the artists want to be told and use it to create a better story moving forward. But at this time, we wanted to open it up to the audience for audience Q&A. What questions do y'all have about the guide? Questions for our panelists? Questions about data collection in general when it comes to artist demographics? Yes, go ahead.
Claudia Einecke. I missed the beginning of the introduction to the panel, so let me ask. So this is only for information about living artists going forward, correct? Did I? Okay. Then I wonder, did you include artists at all in your advisory group? How do they feel? How do people whose data would be collected feel about the necessity to do it and how to do it? Did you? No. Thank you.
There was an artist dissemination group.
There was also, this is terrible, I'm blanking on her name because I had dinner with her and she was so lovely, and I'm just having like this absolute terrible brain fog, but who was one of the readers and reviewers on this as well. And I think so many of us, as we approach this work, we're informed by our own conversations and relations with artists. I think that is foundational. And also I think as this best practices, they're not narrowly prescriptive. They're really a kind of roadmap to how you go through the process of building something like this. And part of that is talking to artists. And so I think that that's really key. I don't know if anyone else wants to say something about that, but I sense two parts of your question, which is also about deceased artists, which is also an issue. But before we break off into that section, does anyone?
I vaguely remember parts of the guide talking about deceased artists and how to be ethical around collecting and having those data. So that is addressed in the guide, even though this is more of a proactive, living artist moving forward.
Yes, but there are questions that I think are going to be distinct for deceased artists, where there are times where you're really going to need a developed research methodology, which is not really central to this document. But there are things in this document that I think are relevant if you're working with an artist foundation, an artist estate, someone who has some authority. Obviously, as Liz pointed out very early on, that's not the ideal. Really, we want the voice of the artist whenever we can get it. But when we can't get it, to have someone who can represent that artist in the best way possible. I think in a lot of ways we want this work to be done so carefully because it's so important that it's done carefully, but we also don't want the perfect to become the enemy of the good, as Marissa pointed out earlier.
Yeah, we collected, or we created a a Google form to collect data several years ago. And we tested it out on some people and got responses and then adapted it and changed it. But we haven't been using it. And part of the reason is this issue of privacy, which I see is in your guide that you've listed, and also legal implications of holding that data. Because even if you have an opt-out question, they might not realize that they should have opted out. Things could change in their life. And so I was sort of curious about that aspect, also using Google Forms. Have y'all talked about the kinds of technology for a small institution that doesn't have IT? What's a safe way, first of all, of collecting that information so it doesn't end up being taken or, somehow co-opted by some other entity? And then also over time, how do you hold that data and protect it?
That issue certainly came up a lot. There's a legal section to the best practices. I work in a federal museum. There were representatives in some of the working groups that worked in state institutions, and they were very uncomfortable with some of the areas that people were proposing for questions for the questionnaire. There were things like, what if an artist is a refugee? What kind of information do you want to be recording about them? And where are you putting this? And who has access to this? And so all of that is part and parcel of the best practices for even just conceiving of the questionnaire. And again, going back to, don't ask questions that you feel like you can't be responsible for the answers. And then there's also, I've worked in a lot of small institutions. So yeah, it's a big project to take on, just the administration of the answers. How do you save them? Do you have a digital asset management system that'll take documents, just to save them there? Are you going to keep paper copies? All of this, it is a whole ecosystem of questions that need to be hammered out, but that's why you build a team that is cross-departmental in your institution. You certainly have some legal oversight early on, and just sort of just keep building your foundation before you start sending out the questionnaire.
I reread the legal section today because that's what I'm least expert on. But one of the things that really enforces is that for a lot of the kind of information that we cover, and for the kinds of institutions that museums are in the US, that it's not there's not that many legal issues with it, actually. There's a kind of tepidness, there's a kind of sense that there will be, but just for the scale of what we are, that we're not held to the same kind of standard for data privacy as someone like Google. That being said, that's all the more reason that we have to be clear, like, if you really need this to be private, don't share it with us. Even if we say we're just going to report it on the aggregate, that's not something that we can ultimately keep absolutely secure. And so to be clear about that as you're taking in the information. But that is addressed explicitly. And I think that in a lot of ways, that section is very reassuring to read on a legal front, but of course, still to talk within your institution.
We have a Zoom question that says, to Liz's great point about not burdening the artists, might there be a way to extend this initiative to an information sharing platform of some sort? If there was full transparency with the artists that the information X museum collects, may it be shared with peer institutions who have also collected or will be collecting their work?
That's the dream and the moonshot. I mean, I think that's when we were all talking early on. I think that's everyone was like, that would be so great. And then it was like, how are we gonna get there? And it's maybe one day, but
Yeah, I mean, some of us nominated the Getty. I don't know if we have any representatives in the room. I think we need the institution that's equipped to step forward, and certainly we need a greater funding effort in order to achieve this, because I think, yes, it is the systems, the data management systems, but it's also like the collective legal implications and everybody being on the same page and comfortable. So that is a much larger effort that I think this is, I wouldn't call it a stopgap, because it's going to have immediate practical, real and inspirational changes in each of our institutions when we do it in the short term. But in the longer term, I think we should absolutely be working towards that.
I just need to plus one, the act of data collection can be an intervention in and of itself, and doing the work at the institution level will allow for some of those greater outcomes that you were talking about earlier when it comes to making sure that that representation does exist. So though I am an advocate for a overall database, there is something that happens at that institutional level that's really critical.
yeah, that's such a good point, because it requires so many people to become trained. It requires you to have so many of those conversations across departments with people who might not be thinking about it. It really is a way to kind of occasion this kind of deeper engagement with these questions that some people may avoid, and that if you had an easier answer, it would be much easier, which would be great. But you wouldn't have to have those same kind of conversations. So I love that. Flipping it around, making a positive.
I'm not with the Getty, but I am on the Getty Vocabulary Steering Committee. So you can contribute information that you have about artists to ULAN to be shared in a more systematic way. You can do that as a one-off. You can do that as a spreadsheet of over 1,000 artists. If you're in a museum that has a less represented collection of artists, I really recommend that you consider that. And as we've been working on this project, I've sort of gone through the whole spectrum of thinking like, oh, we need a grant to develop a whole platform and to sort of collaborate and bring this data together. But I think really we could probably do as much good and much quicker using things that are already out there. So using something like Wikidata, yes, it can be edited by other people, and yes, there are bots that will go on there and add a gender property based on a first name and things that we don't feel as comfortable with. However, it already exists and it can be utilized, and it is a very low bar for learning. And then there's something, I won't get too technical, but then there's also Wikibase, which would be like a consortium of museums could get together and do something on that platform, and that is locked down, but it does create an ID that can be shared between systems, and that would hold a lot of these demographic properties.
Progress.
Jen Margle from Boston. Thank you for being nerdy. I really appreciate it. And I know we're at the end of the day, so I won't hold people from wine. So I had a conversation with the artist Natalie Jaramanjenko, who I know is born in Queensland. She speaks with an accent, you know, and most recently when I saw her in Boston, she said, and I'm Ukrainian. And I said, oh, this is fascinating. She'd never identified herself in writing or anything like that before. So my question is about, and it would be awesome if it were in this Wiki universe, and I think they have them in Wiki, a timestamp.
Oh.
And the option to update. When I looked at the sample in the issue guide, I didn't see like, would you like us to contact you in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, like an automatic AI like sends out an email to this address to update this. And I love the way you talk, David, about this isn't fixed in time, but I do feel like if an artist had the potential to update it when they wanted to in reaction to a political situation or a political reality or a life event, that would be amazing.
Yeah, I think definitely that idea that the artist has access and control over that information on a rolling basis. So that means the ability to have someone that they can contact, potentially that you're contacting them if you can work that into your workflows, that they can ask for things to be changed, they can ask for things to be deleted. Also, this is that timestamp, you know, something we talked about a lot, and really I should, do you want to talk about data provenance, marking that, and or should I just
go for it?
Oh yeah, to make sure that when you're storing this information, that you're storing where it came from, when you got it, hopefully that it came from the artist, but that if it did come from a representative of the artist, or it's based on information from an interview or based on information that you had in a conversation, that you know where that information came from and that that's part of what you're entering, so that you don't just have a database where it has all of these little bits of data without any sense of where they came from. Because of course, as we all know, everyone here does a lot of research, you know, some sources are better than others, and when that information came out is so important. And so to really make sure that that is something you're baking into the way that you're tracking this information. Also, I thought this is where your question was going at first in a different way, but also to make sure that you're distinguishing, and I think that in general this can become a kind of tricky thing, between ideas like nationality, ethnicity, race. They can be so interwoven with one another that it can become difficult, but it's also easy to collapse those things in ways that are inappropriate. And so to make sure that that is not what you are doing when you're asking questions, to consider those things in particular, I think that's an easy place that sometimes people get tripped up on.
And that is unfortunately all the time we have today to nerd out over data. So thank you all for wrapping up today with us. We really appreciate our panelists for joining us and all the amazing work gone into the guide. Thank you.